Welcome to another episode of Image Rights by N. Mashinini, the only podcast dedicated to image rights in Africa and around the globe. Today, we are talking a lot more about image rights online, but also specifically about tax law issues. And joining me, the expert for today is Mr. Ruddy Kabwe, who is an assistant lecturer at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's also a doctoral candidate in the same institution with a thesis that focuses on the use of technology in the administration of taxes. He holds an LLB from UP, an LLM in tax law from UNISA, for which the LLM mini dissertation was titled Consumption Collection Models in Online Trade in Digital Goods. Very interesting. We'll be getting into that. Mr. Kabwe is also an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa and is currently practicing as such. He has previously lectured at Varsity College from 2019 to 2021, and he taught tax law, taxation, civil procedure, banking law, law of negotiable instruments, and aspects of financial law. Mr. Kabwe's interests in research lie in tax law, banking law, financial technology law, as well as data privacy law. Mr. Kabwe is also published in peer-reviewed accredited journals. Wow. Welcome, Ruddy. How are you doing today?
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I am doing very well. It was very, very hot here in Pretoria, but otherwise I'm doing very well. Thank you.
It's also very hot in Johannesburg, and I'm feeling the heat a lot more because I'm still getting used to living in Johannesburg.
Since the focus of the topic is image rights, taxation, and a bit of technology, perhaps we should develop some sort of technology that can help us control the weather. That would be nice.
Well, yeah, that would be very nice. But of course, whatever income we get from there will be taxed.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the difficult part.
So in this season 2 of the podcast, we've been looking a lot at African perspectives and African jurisprudence and regulatory approaches to image rights. And, one of the aspects that is often unknown to the broader community is that image rights taxation is quite problematic, because as much as we can get excited about the commercial exploitation of image rights, in a particular context, especially of sports player specifically, tax regulation has been challenging in a number of jurisdictions. And, in general as well, outside of the image rights context, tax issues have equally been challenged by online generated income, as well as income that is quite unusual in the sense that it's not in the normal type of currency that is formally recognized by the regulatory authorities of each country, right? Yeah. So we see cryptocurrencies coming into the picture, raising a lot of tax questions as well. And so I wanted to invite Ruddy here to speak to us about this intersection between tax law, image rights, firstly in the broad sense, and then later on we'll unpack how the digital developments and innovations in finance technology world are influencing the space. So Ruddy, the first thing that I would like for you to do is to just take us through the intersection between image rights and tax law in a broader sense.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So as I'm going to I'm just going to briefly explain what image rights are, just to give a bit of a background for the listeners. So image rights is basically the ability of a person to control their image, their reputation, identity, voice, signature in advertisements, and particularly in media as well. So I'm just going to give an example, quick example. So football fans will know Lionel Messi. They know that during the Champions League, for instance, there's a particular advert where he's basically chewing or is having crisps, and those crisps are basically sponsored by, I think it's Lay's. And then in addition to that, there's also a commercial where Thierry Henry is also advertising football. I think it's also relevant because it talks about football and the Champions League. So these kind of representations of individuals, whereby they, in addition to their voice and their presence, the companies or the brands use their image or their persona and pay them. And as a result of that, they receive income. And now the question now becomes, where does tax law come in? Because as you can imagine, if I am a sports person, I'm earning income from my football club. In addition to that, I have extra income that I generate from commercials, media, and image rights. Does, first of all, the taxman know about this income? And if so, how would they tax that income? Because the whole idea is image rights is basically vested in the idea of me as a person. Me as a person, I have an interest in my identity. And my identity includes, as I said, the image, reputation, identity, in my voice, and even my personality. Now, ideally, if somebody takes that, my proprietary interest in my and my image rights, and if a person or an entity or company uses that image without my consent and makes commercial revenue out of it, I lose out. So it is detrimental to me because I suffer economic loss. So that's why this interest, the idea of image rights, must be protected. And it is ideally protected through contracts and through companies. Sometimes players set up companies whereby the image rights are controlled by those specific companies. So now usually where tax law comes in is, well, in as much as we have image rights, we generate revenue. Players and individuals generate revenue from those activities, those media adverts, the use of voices, and so on. And it's a lot of money. And sometimes it's actually the revenue generated from image rights is actually more than the actual salaries that the players get from the professional contracts. So understandably, the taxman or the tax authorities have an interest, because it is not fair to only get taxed on your professional contract, but not on your promotional part of your services. Because as you can imagine, as much as you're a football player, there's certain other revenue that you're going to generate, and that income that you generate must be taxed. So that is where the image rights and taxation come together.
Interesting. I don't know if this discourages or encourages people to exploit their image rights, especially because we're seeing ordinary persons, so non-public figures, becoming influencers and the like, and they are beginning to also exploit their image rights, and signing huge deals with product and service providers.
Yeah.
So I think this is probably the one aspect of image rights exploitation that is a bit discouraging when one thinks of venturing into the kind of space where you can have a commercial aspect to your image that is exploitable. But, I want to ask you to contextualize this in the African context, because I know that the tax regimes in the African continent are also facing unique challenges. And so could you take us through the regulatory practices or trends that we're seeing specifically in image rights taxation in the context of African sports players or even other African public figures?
Okay, all right. So I'm going to look at, I'm going to start with South Africa.
Right.
South Africa has a lot of, is known for, of course, the rugby, which is quite a strong sport in the country, football, cricket, and to such an extent, tennis as well. But as you can imagine, sports people don't have a knowledge, don't necessarily have a background in law and or taxation. Now, if I'm a football player and or rugby player, and I get approached by a company or a commercial entity and say, okay, we like what you do on the pitch, and we would like to then, can you help us then promote our product? We're going to use your name, we're going to use your image in this product. And the person agrees, obviously, because it's commercial interest to them, and and they're going to generate a lot of money. They generate a lot of money, they generate revenue, but what's striking is that they don't often get advised on the tax aspect. So sometimes it is possible, and in as much as I've seen a few cases in Europe where a couple of high-profile players were brought before the court. I think, if I remember correctly, Messi and Ronaldo were actually brought before the court in Spain for tax evasion. It's not necessarily that they did it intentionally, it's because they're professional football players. They don't necessarily have the background in taxation. And coming to the South African context, there's no specific regulation or law that deals with the taxation of image rights. As you can imagine, if there's no specific law that deals with that specific aspects of taxation and image rights, then we then fall down to either the common law or the constitution. Now, the idea of image rights is not specifically defined, neither in the common law or legislation. So it's couched in the idea of privacy. Because as you can imagine, if my image, my reputation is taken or is used without my consent, some aspect of my privacy is infringed. So I need to protect that. I need to protect that. But if no law specifically looks at how and what remedies are available, then the best way I can do this is then use the constitution or the common law and then sue the party that offended me based on contract or breach of intellectual property, for instance. So it is possible that in as much as the person generates a lot of, or the entity generates a lot of income, but if I sue them, I may not necessarily get the just rewards because the law doesn't specifically cater for that. And in my research, I was also looking at Kenya. Kenya is another example. They're a bit similar to ACE in the sense that they don't have a specific regulatory framework that deals with the taxation of image rights. So what then falls onto what remedies then a person or natural spokesperson has then is, in the sense of Kenya, is the Kenyan constitution. There's also a common law, consumer protection, and intellectual property. So those are the mechanisms that a spokesperson in Kenya can use in order to enforce their right to privacy. Privacy, of course, is general because it also extends to the idea of image rights. So that is something that I've seen as well throughout the African continent. There's no specific regulatory framework that assesses or deals with image rights. So if I'm a football player or a Kenyan rugby player, for instance, and I have been offered a huge contract of commercial value for the use or exploitation of my image rights in the UK, for instance. So then the issue then becomes, where is that going to be taxed? Is it going to be taxed in the UK? Or is it going to be taxed in Kenya? Because I'm the one who's receiving the revenue. So if there's no specific agreement between the UK and Kenya as to who should tax that commercial revenue, then again, that leaves a gap in the law.
Wow.
Yeah, so that is why it's very important for tax authorities to try and perhaps have a specific regulatory framework that caters for the taxation of image rights. And another thing that you point out, Dr. Mashinini, is the idea of the virtual world as well. I think which we'll also discuss a bit later on. If I decide to sell my image rights in the virtual world, now if the tax authorities are not aware, then I do not get taxed. So ultimately, the country where I am a resident or a citizen loses out.
Yeah.
So it can be construed as a form of evasion because you are not declaring income that you were supposed to declare.
See, what I find interesting here is that besides the focus on taxing the artist or the sports player, etc., I think there's much to be said about taxing the sports club that the sports player is affiliated with. Or I think what I'm trying to get here is to see what is the kind of relationship that is similar to an employer-employee relationship in the context of sports players specifically, or artists and their agents or agencies. And as they get paid, typically in employee context, taxation happens both sides. So both the employee and the employer get taxed.
Yeah.
Is it the same for sports players and sports clubs, for instance? Artists and their agencies should both be taxed for image rights exploitation, or is it strictly the personality whose image is being exploited that is taxed?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. So I'm going to use the South African context here. So in South Africa, if I am an employee, let's say, for instance, I'm a football player, right? I play for PS. PS is a sports, is a football club. That PS, that football club generates revenue in itself. And they pay me a salary. Let's say I get paid 100,000 Rand a month. Ordinarily, that 100,000 is my, should be my net income. Net in the sense that my employer, which is the football club, should have deducted a certain amount of tax. And then it remains the responsibility of the football club to then pay that tax that they deducted to the respective tax authorities. So that's ordinarily what would have happened, because we have, in as much as we have a mutual contract, there's also a responsibility on the employer, in this case the football club, to deduct a certain amount of a tax and remit it to the revenue authorities. Now, it can happen now, as a football player, I have a contract with my football club. But now let's say an important company like Coca-Cola approaches me to then do adverts for them. Now, this contract that I signed with Coca-Cola is in addition to the contract that I have with the football club. So the separate contract that I have with Coca-Cola, normally you would think that the drafters of the contract have placed a clause that says that the employer would have then the same rights to then deduct a certain amount and pay it to the revenue service. But more often than not, there's no such clause. So in addition to my sports contract, with the one that I have with the club, I have another contract with Coca-Cola, and I generate revenue. And it is possible that that revenue that I generate for the use of my image rights with Coca-Cola is not taxed. And for that reason, it is very possible that tax that was supposed to be collected goes uncollected. So then it remains then the responsibility of the football player, in this instance, to then declare that income and then notify the revenue service that I have a contract with Coca-Cola. It relates to my image rights. My image rights relate to the commercials that have been on TV. I need to pay over the tax. But because I do not do that, this is when now issues arise. Because sometimes players have additional contracts that are not necessarily linked to their professional contracts, but promotional contracts linked to their image rights. And this is when now issues arise as to who is the taxpayer, how much does the taxpayer owe, and so on.
Wow, this is so complex. I can imagine that a lot falls through the cracks here.
Yes.
Yeah. So what becomes more interesting is that, look, we're living in a very digitally innovative world today, especially in the aspects of financial technology law. And I'm just thinking about the entrance of cryptocurrencies into the picture. I mean, recently we've seen how the Namibia Central Bank has accepted cryptocurrencies as a form of payment, even though it's not legally recognized as currency. and Namibia is moving towards improving their regulatory frameworks for virtual cash regulation issues in order to enable and facilitate payment for goods and services through cryptocurrency. So they've officially announced that their retailers and so forth can accept crypto as a form of payment, even though it's not legally recognized as currency. So this gets me thinking about how these African nations, broadly speaking, how do they grapple with the incoming of cryptocurrencies, and how this will also affect the approaches to image rights taxation? Because we know that there's a lot of room for evasion in the crypto world. Can you touch on that, please?
Yes, it's quite fascinating that the world is changing at a very rapid pace, and what's actually striking is that technology is moving so quickly that as consumers, as tax regulators, as the government, we find it difficult to keep up with the constant changes in technology. And in as much as there are certain countries that, as you mentioned, Namibia, that are trying to regulate cryptocurrencies, you find that this is just an issue in the sense that, in as much as one country has accepted that, okay, we're going to use cryptocurrency as a form of payment, the rest might follow. And then other countries throughout the world can decide, okay, let's follow. But the issue is, if we don't have a common standard or common agreement internationally as to what constitutes cryptocurrencies and how to use cryptocurrencies, it's going to become difficult. Because now imagine if I'm a football player, all right, and I am a resident of, for instance, Nigeria. I do my trade in the English Premier League. Now, let's say I am home for the break, for the December break, and then I inform my club, okay, can you please pay me in cryptocurrencies? So my football club is in the UK, I'm in Nigeria. Now, if I decide, I inform my club, can you pay me using cryptocurrencies? Now, let's say the UK accepts or uses cryptocurrencies as a form of payment, and Nigeria does not, for purposes of this example. There are going to be challenges, because I'm going to say, but the UK uses cryptocurrencies or accepts cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. It's my salary. But the Nigerian authorities will be like, we do not accept cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. So then there is inconsistency in the sense that both jurisdictions have different views as to what cryptocurrency is and what it can be used for. Because cryptocurrency, as you correctly pointed out, can be used as a form of payment. So that payment that the football player in this example that I gave decides I'm going to accept, that acceptance basically means that that cryptocurrency payment is income. So if the regulatory authorities in my country refuse to accept it, that basically means that they're refusing to accept my income. So this issue of cross-border payments, there's an issue for that. There's also issue of the respective reserve banks. And then there's also issue of property, because money is property. So if the state is unlawfully, you can argue unlawfully, preventing you from getting property inside the country, then it infringes on a constitutional right. So it is a very complex area, which I feel that there should be, at the very least, some sort of bilateral agreements between countries, at the very least. Because if this continues, whereby one jurisdiction accepts, the other one does not, and the other one does, another one does not, it's going to lead to a lot of fragmentation. And fragmentation means inconsistencies. Inconsistencies also means there's going to be a lot of challenges, litigation-wise. And a lot of people might feel that, well, since my country does not accept this form of payment, then I'm going to then leave the country and go to another country where this payment is being offered, and I can then receive my income, because there's no point staying in my country because I'm not allowed to receive that income. So it's going to be very difficult, and that's why you can see a lot of people then migrating. It's going to migrating to other countries because the regulatory approach there is a little bit more lenient as opposed to the regulatory approaches in their country where they're citizens or nationals?
I think I'm less concerned personally about those who migrate, because there are various reasons why people will migrate, right?
Yes.
But I'm more concerned about those who stay in their countries, but then keep their cryptos in offshore accounts, and still somehow manage to convert their crypto into legally recognized currencies. And then just like that, avoid or evade tax, because obviously then it is up to them to declare that I've actually received some kind of income. And I remember in South Africa, when crypto started booming, this was something that the South African Revenue Services also sort of aired out, that even though cryptos are not a legal form of payment in South Africa, whatever income you get from trading in cryptos, you need to declare for tax purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's opening up a sort of tricky and very layered problem. Yes. Because I imagine that it may also be difficult to trace some of these funds.
Absolutely.
If they're moving through, if they're moving through the cryptocurrency and blockchain streams.
Yeah. Because so to respond to your statement, it is quite fascinating that as a tax authority, as government, I can put out a statement and say, if you have received cryptocurrencies during this time, during this period, you have to declare it. Well and good. But let's say that I declare it, but then the person I'm declaring it to doesn't know what I'm talking about. Now that is an issue. Because an issue, because then I can then say, well, I came to your offices and I declared the income, but the person that received me did not know what I was talking about. So can you objectively say then I evaded taxes? Because if I came to you and you said, I don't know what you're talking about, can that be considered as a form of tax evasion? If I had the intention and I made the effort to come to you to pay taxes on that receipt of cryptocurrencies. You see, so in as much as, yes, we put out statements, it is also important for regulatory authorities to actually guide taxpayers, educate taxpayers, educate officials on what cryptocurrencies are. Because if you do that, you are less likely to run the risk of having taxpayers, first of all, not declare income. And it is also important for the tax officials to actually know what they're doing. Because if I am a tax official, I understand the system, I understand cryptocurrencies, I understand how it is done, how it is declared, how the forms must be filled, then it makes the job easier. Then the administrative burden is reduced. And it can also encourage compliance, because if I'm as an official know what I'm talking about, and you know what you're talking about, we're more likely to understand each other. And if we understand each other, then we're more likely to comply.
So much is left to the taxpayer, though. I mean, especially with this whole declaration approach, it sort of says we have no means or no proper and rigid means to find out about whatever income you're making from cryptos, but we trust that you will disclose that you've made this kind of income. And you would think that's enough, but now we are moving so fast also into this NFT space with the so-called non-fungible token space, on also this virtual reality issues with the hype around metaverse, for instance. And that also got me wondering, okay, well, with these alternate universes and sales and merchandise sales made from that, and NFTs that are normally used and also to trade artistic works, for instance, we often see people's images exploited in the form of merchandise as well as artistic works. So how the tax authorities firstly going to be able to address something like this in the context of image rights taxation? And I'm wondering also, what is the impact now of NFTs in particular on image rights taxation? Is there room for even more abuse here? Or given that NFTs are also traded on blockchain, do we think that there could be even an easier way to regulate this kind of image rights exploitation?
It's a very interesting question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try then to explain to our listeners what NFTs are. So NFTs are basically a digital version or a digital representation of an asset. I'm going to give an example. Let's say I have just made a car, right? A brand new car, a brand new name. Now I want to then sell this car. Due to financial constraints, it's not possible to sell physically. So I decide to sell it online because I have an online footprint. Now I then convert that asset, which is my car, digitally into a digital format. Then this digital format becomes an EFT. And then I use the blockchain and particularly the smart contract to then sell it to individuals who are interested. So in as much as I have this online digital platform, it's also possible for me to run the risk of having my digital token stolen or appropriated and then being used for something else that I did initially intend it for. So in as much as, yes, we have these new technologies like NFTs and cryptocurrencies and blockchain, it is also very possible for those systems to be hacked, for instance. Because if it is hacked, if I lose my private keys, if the smart contract is not working, for instance, then I cannot transfer the assets to the person who wants to buy them. If I get hacked into the system and the person then obtains those assets, then I suffer economic loss. And then the interesting thing is with blockchain and cryptocurrencies, they rely on a lot of computational power. And computational power means electricity. And on the African continent, it's very difficult, as you would know, to get consistent supply of electricity. So if we lack in electricity, it's going to be difficult for us to actually even develop NFTs. It's going to be difficult for people to actually use systems like cryptocurrencies and blockchain. So to go back to the tax aspect, now let's say if I'm a football player in Europe or whatever, Africa, and I decide to make my commercial, to sell my image rights to the highest bidder. And then I go onto the blockchain, I then convert my image rights, although it is a personality right, I then decide, okay, I'm going to make a contract with the person that makes me the highest, who wins the highest bid of my image rights. And let's say a bidder bids for, let's say $200 million. I get paid $200 million. Well and good. But the problem is I'm tempted not to declare that as income or as revenue, for the simple reason that the tax authorities do not have access to the blockchain or to the NFT in the smart contracts. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if they don't know, then is it a sin? It's not a sin. Is it a sin if they don't know about it? And then that's how you start now, moving from whether a mechanism lies beyond tax evasion or tax avoidance, because you can structure your affairs in such a way that you pay less taxes. But in South Africa, it is a criminal offense to structure your affairs in such a way that you evade taxes. And if a tax authority is not aware of your arrangements, especially online, and you generate income repeatedly without declaring it in the South African context, especially in terms of the Tax Administration Act, not declaring income that is due to you is a criminal offense. And in as much as, yes, the technology is improving the way we do things, again, as you pointed out, it remains, the onus remains on the taxpayer to then come forward and declare income. If they fail to do that, then revenue goes uncollected. So it's a balance between whether or not the person is reasonable at the end of the day, or between being reasonable and between being greedy. So whichever comes first at the end of the day will most likely win.
Wow. Another thing that I've been thinking about is the unauthorized exploitation of people's images in virtual worlds and also through NFTs, because if we are raising questions of untraceability of these smart contracts and so forth, then how would even a victim of image rights violations trace the fact that someone just sold an NFT that comprises of maybe their image in the form of an artistic piece online? I'm just thinking about how it's already difficult on social media to get some form of remedy or vindication for image rights exploitation because of the way that the social media algorithms work, and also the way that social media invites so many interferences with personality rights across jurisdictions. And I'm also concerned a bit about the lack of sui generis regulation for NFTs in particular. Because as you said, we're dealing with assets here.
Yeah.
Right. Can we take our property laws and cut and paste them to regulate NFTs? Off the bat, I'd say probably not exactly as is.
Yeah.
There may have to be some improvement of these laws. And I think part of the problem with even regulating or protecting image rights, as well as regulating image rights taxation in this context, is that our foundational principles are not airtight enough to deal with these technological innovations.
Yeah.
I think you've really sparked a lot of thoughts in my mind now with this issue around taxation, because look, tax evasion and avoidance is not a new thing. In fact, it's a very old thing.
Yeah.
And even in an ordinary sense, people find themselves making these mistakes of not declaring certain types of income. But I think from our conversation today, what I've taken is that the first big problem here is the definition of income.
Yeah.
And how you define income in each jurisdiction is going to largely influence the ability of the tax authority to tax these new kinds of sources of income.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. In your opinion, do you think that African tax authorities are well equipped to address these developments?
Ooh, that's a very loaded question. Ultimately, it boils down to political will. If the political will is there, then you're going to find national treasuries having the necessary resources to channel to the respective tax authorities so that they can make changes to the tax collection infrastructure. Because what you find that is, especially in most African countries, the situation is so dire that it is very difficult for some countries even to do something as basic as do exchange of information with other relevant tax authorities. Because in as much as we agree, for instance, that as government authorities, we're going to change, we're going to share tax information. But then how is that information going to be exchanged? It's most probably going to be digitally, in a digital form. But if one tax authority doesn't have the infrastructure or the tools or the IT system or even the personnel to do the transfer or to exchange that information, then there is absolutely no point. So we need to allocate resources to tax authorities. We need to give them the tools that will enable them to collect revenue. We need to train IT people, we need to train IT personnel, we need to hire the right people, we need to have political backing. And if we have that, in addition to improving infrastructure, training people, and even spending, even if it's a certain amount of money per term, that will go a long way into ameliorating the current tax collection mechanism, especially in the African continent. Because I think we suffer a lot from a lot of issues with regards to, so I'm just giving an example, electricity, for instance. Electricity is a basic issue. If a country lacks a stable electricity supply, how are you going to then implement IT systems that will enable you to then track and trace taxpayers? Because if the IT systems fail, then that means that the tax collection mechanism will fail by implication. So these are some of the questions that we need to then ask. We need to then have the political will and political backing from the relevant people to enable us to then have systems and the tools in place to collect revenue. Because without revenue, everything just doesn't work.
Yeah, and isn't this what your doctoral thesis is about? I remember when you presented at the Law Teachers Conference in East London, you actually touched on how tax administration could benefit from the use of artificial intelligence systems, but that our contextual problems in Africa present a challenge for this kind of development.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of using artificial intelligence, for instance, remains, for me, in my opinion, it is one of the key aspects that I'm looking at, because I'm of the view that it can greatly improve the way we collect revenue. With AI, for instance, you can able to predict whether or not people will accept it or not is a different issue. For instance, with AI, you're able to predict a taxpayer's pattern, or an AI can then predict when a taxpayer is less likely to comply with certain tax rules. Then, in order to then mitigate the risk or the probability that the taxpayer will not comply, you then approach the taxpayer and say, what is your current situation? We have predicted, or the system has information that may, or that is pointing towards the possibility that you may not be compliant in future. What can we do to assist? Something like that, for instance. Or we can then use systems like the blockchain, for instance, which also falls within my thesis, that looks at perhaps using blockchain as a way to then collect revenue. Because as a blockchain, for instance, a blockchain can be used as a permanent record keeping software, where we can then audit whether or not a taxpayer has in other words, paid taxes over a certain period of time, audit those transactions, and then determine whether or not a taxpayer's tax liability is accurate. So these are the kind of things that we can use. But of course, there are challenges, and I've spoken to them at length. The lack of personnel, especially in the fields of AI, blockchain, IT. I mean, these individuals, if we are to get them, they're going to cost a lot of money. As you can imagine, these are specialists. As a specialist fields, it costs money to train people in these areas. It costs money to hire people who are specialists in these areas. Do the tax authorities have the money to pay these people, for starters? Do the tax authorities have money to then fund this infrastructure? And if they do have money to fund this infrastructure, how long will it take to change the current system and then modernize it with artificial intelligence? How long will that take? Because in as much as we're going to say, okay, fine, we're going to introduce artificial intelligence today, it could take 2 generations to actually see the benefits of modernizing the tax administration. Because it doesn't necessarily follow that if you introduce the system, a new system now, you're going to see the results tomorrow. It's going to take time. So we're looking here at perhaps 2 generations. We should be looking at something that is sustainable within 2 to 3 generations, because results will only come later on and not now.
Wow. As you were speaking, one of the things that came to me was the issue of bias with AI detection systems. I'm just thinking about whether certain taxpayers or non-taxpayers will feel targeted by such a system if we were to embrace a system like that. I'm also thinking about how I recently had a conversation with a lawyer in Brazil about image rights taxation in the context of Brazil. Yeah. And one of the things that came up was how sometimes even in the context of sports players, for instance, the sports clubs would be the ones to sort of initiate or drive the push to evade tax. So they don't declare image rights income, or they over declare certain income in order to avoid paying taxes on image rights. So I'm really wondering if bringing AI into the space without resolving those issues is actually a good idea, given that we already have bias and prejudice issues in the context of AI and related to the ethics of AI across the world, And, Africa is one continent that has had a lot of racial and gender bias issues historically. And I fear that if we haven't dealt with those in an ordinary sense, when we start bringing in the AI into our tax systems, for instance, how are these biases going to trickle into and affect the way in which the tax system works?
Yes, that's a very, 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 very valid question. This is something I'm still currently doing research on. In as much as, yes, I mean, modernizing tax administration and so on does have its benefits. And one of the pitfalls is if you implement artificial intelligence, it may have bias. How do you solve that bias? Is it possible then to program the AI in such a way that it doesn't? I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but there could be mechanisms in place where, for instance, you have ultimately, in as much as we use artificial intelligence, the decision maker, the person that makes the decision ultimately then should then be placed at the hands of an official from the revenue service. So let me put this into context. So then the artificial intelligence determines a certain criteria, has identified a specific taxpayer of a specific color, then they provide that information to the tax official. And the tax official makes an informed decision as to whether or not artificial intelligence or the machine was accurate in its assessment. So then it then remains the decision of the tax official as to whether or not to pursue that matter or not.
All right.
But, so that could be one way of resolving the issue, because I do concede that artificial intelligence does have certain flaws that we may not, which we haven't considered, and which we may not have considered even in 10 years' time, because the whole idea is technology changes rapidly, and that's why we still need the human element present, especially in the tax field and tax administration.
Well, I've also been, as we were talking earlier about image rights taxations more specifically, a question came to my mind was, I wonder whether all these TikTok influencers declare their income. Because, I think what we see often develop in the social media space is how people will start off maybe just doing it for fun, like posting stuff on TikTok and other social media platforms. And then you start seeing them in small time advertisements on social media, and then all of a sudden they're on your TV screen, you know. And I think about people like that who are entering the market at such a rapidly evolving pace. And I say rapidly evolving because they quickly move from being just an ordinary person who takes a video on their phone consistently to all of a sudden becoming people who are receiving income for product and service endorsement. And that is a classic form of image rights exploitations. I wonder really if they declare that I've made 50,000 or whatever the amount may be from endorsing a particular product on TikTok or whatever the case may be. So, with this thought in mind, specifically for young influencers and also young sports players and other artists, what are the 2 tips or points that you could share with us in closing to encourage such persons, the influencers, the sports players, the artists, to not avoid or not evade tax when it comes to income that they generate from exploiting their personality online and in alternate universes?
Yeah, that's another very good question. You see, ultimately, we're dealing with human beings. That's just the reality. We are human. If we get a huge sum of money that we may not necessarily have received before, it's very, very difficult to part ways with that money. It's very difficult to become rational and say, I have received a certain amount of money and I need to declare it because it is in the interest of my community or my country. It is very difficult to be rational, especially in that instance. But I think it's important as a citizen of a specific country to to try at the very least to do what you can. In the sense that if you know you're receiving a certain amount of income, might as well declare it, because yes, if it can get taxed at a very high percentage, but at the very least you would have done your duty as part of a citizen of a specific country, and also you also avoid the necessary hassles of being tracked, of being liable for any criminal offenses, especially here. I'm just contextualizing in SA. If you don't declare income, it is a criminal offense, and you don't want, especially as a public figure, you don't want to have a criminal background, because then not only will you lose your endorsements and your contracts, because it's difficult for companies to associate themselves with persons that have who are not, first of all, tax compliant or law-abiding citizens, because their reputation suffers. So if their reputation suffers, your reputation suffers as well. So it's rather your best interest and in the interest of your country to just declare your income. And then the other thing is try, if possible, get advice from a tax practitioner, because then the duty then rests on the tax practitioner to then give you the best possible advice. But of course, it's important to always give as much information as possible, because if you omit one certain information with the aim of trying to deceive the person, you cannot then say that the advice given by that tax practitioner will be accurate if certain information is outstanding. So rather declare all to the relevant tax practitioner and let them give you the professional advice, so that you avoid the risk of being identified as a non-compliant taxpayer, and also avoid the risk of having your reputation tarnished just because you just wanted a few extra dollars. So that would be my advice.
Interesting. I recently saw Kim Kardashian was fined, but this is really in relation to the marketing of securities and not necessarily tax. And I think another point that people need to consider here is in how you exploit your image you need to also be aware of what other authorities could be expecting you to declare whatever income you make. Because it's not really just a mere tax issue relating to image rights exploitations. There's a lot more going on here. So yeah, it's quite a tricky situation, especially because also some of in particular, the TikTok stars are also young people, people in high school and all of that. And I think it's important to educate not just them, but also their agents, their legal guardians about this sort of thing, because you don't want someone to work so hard to make all that income and then be fined a hefty amount just because of ignorance of law. I think, even though ignorance of law is sometimes a defense, it's not really a strong defense in the context of taxation. But thank you so much for coming to speak to us, Mr. Kabwe. This was a very informative session and it has me buzzing with a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to end it off here. And just as a last word to our audience, where can people reach you for issues relating to tax law in general, financial technology law, blockchain matters, and just to take an interest in some of the research that you're going to be pumping out as soon as you finish that PhD?
And I just want to say again, thank you, Dr. Mashinini, for inviting me to the platform and allowing me to give my 2 cents worth. I will leave my information with Dr. Mashinini, and should anyone have an interest in the work that I'm doing, then they can contact me with the information that I have provided.
All right. And are you on LinkedIn?
Yes, I'm also on LinkedIn, and I also have an org page. I just need to update my LinkedIn page, which will be done very soon. But you can also find me on that platform.
All right. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for this episode.
All right, and thank you for inviting me once again.
Remember to control your image rights.